From Atlanta, Georgia, and New York, this is Democracy Now!
From the beginning, I've said that I would continue on as long as there was a viable path to victory. Tonight, I'm sorry to say, it appears that path has been foreclosed.
We had a tremendous victory tonight. It was a tremendous victory.
Donald Trump wins Indiana and virtually clinches the Republican nomination as Ted Cruz suspends his campaign. In the Democratic race, Bernie Sanders pulls off an upset in Indiana.
I understand that Secretary Clinton thinks that this campaign is over. I've got some bad news for her.
Then Democracy Now!'s own Juan Gonzalez retires from the New York Daily News after 29 years.
I figured my modest contribution would be a voice from another part of New York, not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them, not simply to entertain, but to change, not after the fact, but before it, when coverage could still make a difference.
We'll air Juan Gonzalez's speech when he became the first Latino journalist inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame, and speak to Pulitzer Prize finalist Tom Robbins, who describes Juan as, quote, the most essential reporter in New York these past 3 decades. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Donald Trump has virtually clinched the Republican nomination after his closest rival, Senator Ted Cruz, suspends his campaign following a devastating defeat in the Indiana primary. Trump won about 53% of the vote, capturing 51 delegates in the winner-take-all state. In his concession speech, Senator Cruz shocked his supporters by announcing his withdrawal.
From the beginning, I've said that I would continue on as long as there was a viable path to victory. Tonight, I'm sorry to say, it appears that path has been foreclosed. Together, we left it all on the field in Indiana. We gave it everything we've got. But the voters chose another path.
In the Democratic race, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders pulled a surprise upset in Indiana by winning over 52% of the vote. We'll have more on the results later in the broadcast. The Bernie Sanders campaign has launched a petition urging the Hillary Clinton campaign to transfer money raised by her massive joint fundraising venture to state parties. This comes after a Politico investigation into the unprecedented fundraising vehicle Clinton formed with state parties found less than 1% of the $61 million raised by the venture has actually gone to the state parties. The Hillary Victory Fund is a joint venture between the Democratic National Committee, 32 state committees, and Clinton's campaign. It allows Clinton to collect massive donations at events like the recent dinner at George and Amal Clooney's house. But it turns out that of the $3.8 million the Victory Fund has transferred to the state parties, 88% of it was quickly moved back to the DNC by the Clinton staffer who controls the committee. In Syria, fierce fighting has erupted between rebels and the Syrian regime in the city of Aleppo. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said the battle was the most intense the city has seen for more than a year. Dozens have reportedly been killed. This comes after at least 3 people were killed when a maternity hospital in a government-controlled section of the city was hit by rocket fire. Secretary of State John Kerry said the rockets appeared to have come from a rebel area.
Today's attack on a hospital appears to be rockets that have come from some area of opposition, and we are trying to determine precisely which. So the bottom line is there is no justification for this horrific violence that targets civilians or medical facilities or first responders, no matter who it is.
The hospital attack came days after the Syrian regime destroyed a Doctors Without Borders-backed hospital, killing the last pediatrician in the rebel-held East Aleppo. The UN Security Council has unanimously passed a resolution reminding states they must protect medical and aid workers. But Joanne Liu, president of Doctors Without Borders, noted 4 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council have been tied to attacks on hospitals, including the United States for its destruction of a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. Liu said the attacks must stop.
4 of the 5 permanent members of this council have, to varying degrees, been associated with coalition responsible for attacks on health structure over the last year. These include the NATO-led coalition in Afghanistan, the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, the Russia-backed Syrian-led coalition.
U.S. Navy SEAL Charles Keating IV has been killed in northern Iraq. The Pentagon said Keating was serving as an advisor to Kurdish Peshmerga forces and died as a result of a, quote, coordinated and complex attack by about 100 ISIS militants. Keating is the grandson of Charles Keating, Jr., the late financier who served prison time for his role in the 1980s savings and loan scandals. In Canada, a raging wildfire has forced tens of thousands of people to evacuate from the heart of the Alberta oil sands region. The entire community of Fort McMurray has been ordered to leave. It's the largest wildfire evacuation in Alberta's history. Scientists have linked the increase in wildfires to climate change. The Detroit Teachers Union has urged teachers to return to work today after teacher sick-outs over a funding shortfall shuttered nearly all of the district's 97 schools for a second day Tuesday. The teachers called out after learning the district may not have the money to pay them at the end of the school year. But union officials say they've now received assurances that teachers will be paid. Detroit teachers have also protested black mold, rat infestations, and other dire conditions in their schools. Georgia Republican Governor Nathan Deal has vetoed a bill that would have allowed people to carry concealed weapons on college campuses. In a statement, Deal said it was, quote, highly questionable the measure would make students safer. A similar measure became law in Tennessee this year. In Honduras, a prominent radio journalist has been shot 4 times but survived. Felix Molina was reportedly attacked twice in the same day Monday. He was shot twice in each leg. In a statement released by a human rights group, Molina said he believed he was directly targeted and vowed to continue practicing journalism without fear. He said, quote, I declare myself a survivor of the insecurity that the majority of the country faces. Molina's shooting came on the eve of World Press Freedom Day. Labor activists targeted the clothing retailer H&M over the safety of its supplier factories in Bangladesh. As H&M shareholders met in Sweden, organizers rallied in front of the Times Square H&M store in New York to demand safe conditions.
My name is Elizabeth Klein. I'm a journalist and the author of Overdress, The Shockingly High Cost of Cheap Fashion, and I'm out here today to demand that H&M provide safe working conditions for their Bangladeshi factory workers. They have over 100,000 workers in making their clothes in Bangladesh, and currently the majority of them are working in facilities without legal fire exits. So their lives are literally on the line in the name of making cheap clothes for Western consumers. No one should die in the name of making cheap fashion.
In February, an H&M supplier factory in Bangladesh caught fire early in the morning before most of the factory's 6,000 workers arrived. In Washington state, 6 workers at the Hanford nuclear site have undergone medical evaluations for possible exposure to chemical vapors. In total, more than 30 workers are being evaluated for possible exposure to vapors resulting from radioactive waste from the U.S. nuclear weapons program, which is stored in underground tanks at the site. Last month, it was revealed thousands of gallons of radioactive waste had leaked between two walls of one of the tanks, an incident a former worker called catastrophic. Former New York State Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver has been sentenced to 12 years in prison after being convicted of corruption charges. Silver served as New York Assembly Speaker for over 2 decades and was one of New York's most powerful politicians. He was convicted of abusing his office to rake in more than $4 million in illegal bribes and kickbacks. In New York City, voters who say they were blocked from casting a ballot in last month's New York presidential primary packed a Board of Elections hearing on Tuesday. Some 126,000 Brooklyn voters were purged from the Democratic rolls ahead of the primary. Voting rights activist Ivan Gugizlet spoke out.
May 5th, the New York City Board of Elections has to hand over their primary results, and that percentage, that number, is certified. If those votes are certified, no evidence that we find will matter in the court of law. If the votes are certified by the New York City Board of Elections on May 5th at 3:30 p.m., nothing that we find in the future is going to change that primary result. And so we as activists are working alongside with the lawyers in court, Election Justice USA. They are fighting to get a court order. They are trying to stop the elections from getting certified. We are here at the Board of Elections to put pressure on them, ask questions, tell them what happened, find out what's going on.
An Indian man who follows the Sikh religion is speaking out after he says he was pulled off a bus and detained for 30 hours for speaking Punjabi with another passenger. Daljit Singh was traveling on a Greyhound bus from Arizona to Indiana when a fellow passenger falsely accused the two men of speaking Arabic and discussing a bomb threat. Fellow passengers detained the men in Amarillo, Texas, until police arrived and arrested them at gunpoint. The police also removed Singh's religious turban and circulated mugshots of him without the turban to local media. Singh and the Sikh coalition have demanded criminal charges against the passengers who accused and restrained him. Meanwhile, in California, a group of women say they were kicked out of a cafe in Laguna Beach last month for being Muslim and wearing hijabs. Sarah Forsak said she and her friends were told to leave the restaurant within 10 minutes while their desserts and coffee were still on the table. A worker said the restaurant needed to clear tables for other clients, but Forsak said there were numerous empty tables and other customers were not asked to leave. President Obama's heading to Flint, Michigan today. His visit comes weeks after 3 Michigan officials were criminally charged for their involvement in the Flint water contamination crisis. The lead poisoning began when an unelected emergency manager appointed by Michigan Governor Snyder switched the source of Flint's drinking water to the corrosive Flint River. Obama's expected to meet today with Mariana Kopeny, an 8-year-old Flint girl who wrote to him asking him to come to Flint. She wrote, "I am one of the children that's affected by this water, and I've been doing my best to march and protest and to speak out for all the kids that live here in Flint." To see our documentary, Thirsty for Democracy, The Poisoning of an American City, that's about Flint, you can go to democracynow.org. And Afeni Shakur, a former Black Panther activist and mother of the late hip-hop artist Tupac Shakur, has died at the age of 69. Afeni Shakur's activism was a source of inspiration for her son's music. Tupac Shakur was killed in a still unsolved drive-by shooting in Las Vegas in 1996. Afeni Shakur died in California Monday after suffering what is believed to be a heart attack. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. Juan Gonzalez is in New York. Hello, Juan.
Hello, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Well, Donald Trump has virtually clinched the Republican nomination after Senator Ted Cruz suspended his campaign following a devastating defeat in the Indiana primary. Trump won about 53% of the vote, capturing 51 delegates in the winner-take-all state. In his concession speech last night, Ted Cruz shocked his supporters by announcing his withdrawal.
From the beginning, I've said that I would continue on as long as there was a viable path to victory. Tonight, I'm sorry to say, it appears that path has been foreclosed. Together, we left it all on the field in Indiana. We gave it everything we've got. But the voters chose another path. And so, with a heavy heart, but with boundless optimism for the long-term future of our nation, we are suspending our campaign. But hear me now, I am not suspending our fight for liberty. I am not suspending our fight to defend the Constitution, to defend the Judeo-Christian values that built America. Our movement will continue. And I give you my word that I will continue this fight with all of my strength and all of my ability.
With Senator Ted Cruz dropping out, Ohio Governor John Kasich becomes Donald Trump's only remaining challenger. Reaction among the Republican establishment to Trump remains divided. Republican Party Chair Reince Priebus tweeted, "Real Donald Trump will be presumptive GOP nominee. We all need to unite and focus on defeating Hillary Clinton. #NeverClinton." However, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham tweeted, "If we nominate Trump, we will get destroyed, and we will deserve it." During a victory speech in New York, Donald Trump set his eyes on November.
We're going after Hillary Clinton. She will not. She will not be a great president. She will not be a good president. She will be a poor president. She doesn't understand trade. Her husband signed, perhaps in the history of the world, the single worst trade deal ever done. It's called NAFTA. And I was witness to the carnage over the last 6 weeks especially.
Meanwhile, in the Democratic race, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders pulled a surprise upset by winning just over 52% of the vote.
I understand that Secretary Clinton thinks that this campaign is over. I've got some bad news for her. Tonight, we won a great victory in Indiana. Next week, we're going to be in West Virginia. We think we have a real shot to win in that great state. Then we're going to Kentucky and we're going to Oregon. We think we have a pretty good chance to win there as well. And then we're going to another bunch of other states, culminating in the largest state in the United States with the most delegates, and that is the state of California. And we think we have a pretty good chance to win there. And I think that as more and more delegates to the Democratic Convention take a hard look at which candidate is generating the kind of enthusiasm, excitement, voter turnout that we need to make sure that somebody like a Donald Trump does not become president. I think you're going to see more and more delegates concluding that that candidate is Bernie Sanders.
Despite Bernie Sanders' victory, Hillary Clinton still holds a commanding lead in the delegate count. To talk more about Donald Trump's rise to power and also the upset by Bernie Sanders, we're joined by Tom Robbins, investigative journalist in residence at the CUNY Journalism School. He was recently named a Pulitzer Prize finalist for his reporting on the culture of violence in New York's prisons. In the 1980s, he covered politics, labor, and organized crime for the Daily News and the Village Voice from 1985 to 2011. His recent article for the Marshall Project is Trump and the Mob. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Tom. Well, why don't you begin by talking about, really, this historic night in Indiana Start with Donald Trump now becoming the presumptive Republican nominee with Ted Cruz pulling out.
All right. Good morning. Who'd have thunk it, right? I mean, you have the slickest con man out of New York City and has just been basically made the Republican nominee by the Hoosiers of Middle America. It's an astonishing thing, and I guess it goes to show that the Republicans have just as little idea as to who their base is as the Democrats.
Well, Tom, you're one of the few people who has touched on Trump's amazing history in relationship to organized crime in America that's gotten virtually no attention. Could you talk about some of the characters that you and other reporters have unearthed years ago, but it's not being paid attention to in this campaign, starting with the infamous Roy Cohn?
Yes. Roy Cohn is a figure in American history who is well known to people, at least of our generation, probably not so much to the one that's casting a lot of ballots now. But Roy Cohn was the sidekick and chief witch hunter for Senator Joseph McCarthy, a guy who reminds a lot of people of Ted Cruz. You know, they both look alike and they talk alike. And after Roy Cohn had left the Senate, he went into private practice, and he set himself up basically as the House counsel to a couple of the crime bosses in New York City, the Genovese crime family and the Gambino crime family. And at the same time, he adopted a young developer from Queens looking to make his first mark as a developer in Manhattan named Donald J. Trump. And Donald J. Trump will tell you to this day that he learned how to play politics and he learned how to play development from Roy Cohn while he was sitting in Roy Cohn's East Side townhouse next to Fat Tony Salerno and Big Paul Castellano. And in terms of Trump's forays first into Atlantic City and then some of the construction industry jobs he took on to build his towers in New York? Well, to be a developer in New York City, to be fair, you had to, in those days, this is talking about the late 70s, the 1980s, early 90s, you had to brush up against the mob. They were a force both on the employer side and particularly on the union side. But despite that problem, Donald Trump seemed to keep running into them over and over again. They bought apartments in his Trump Tower, in Trump Plaza. You know, they kept showing up as people that he was carousing with. And then when he went to Atlantic City, and one of the things I did recently in this piece for the Marshall Project was I put up this old FBI memo that I've had for many years in which Donald Trump met with a couple of FBI agents protesting that he was concerned that in Atlantic City there might be organized crime figures, and what could he do to protect himself from this? Which is a little like saying, is it true that there was a guy named Al Capone once who didn't pay his taxes? And he did go to Atlantic City. He promptly got in bed with half a dozen mobsters who he bought land from down there.
Tom, I want to turn to the memo. The memo says, quote, Trump advised agents that he had read in the press media and had heard from various acquaintances that organized crime elements were known to operate in Atlantic City. Trump also expressed at this meeting the reservation that his life and those around him would be subject to microscopic examination. Right. Trump advised that he wanted to build a casino in Atlantic City, but he did not wish to tarnish his family's name.
You know,
Tom Robbins.
Yes, you know, I'm so glad you read that in detail, Amy. You know, it was one of the most remarkable statements coming from a man who was invited the most microscopic examination, not only of his life, but his children's life, all of his wives' lives. Tarnish his name. You know, this is a man who has emblazoned his name all over every building that he can find, and without any compunctions as to who he associated with. And it didn't just stop in Atlantic City. Right up until recently, this latest Trump hotel in New York, at least it has his name on it, even though he's not the owner, the Trump Soho down on Spring Street. As the New York Times revealed a few weeks ago, his partners in that were a bunch of Russian mobsters. And when he was asked about it, Donald Trump had the same thing that he said about the mobsters in Atlantic City, about the ones in development that he dealt with in New York. He wouldn't know them if he met them. What about Dan Sullivan? You write about him, and talk about that and the Polish immigrant workers that Trump employed. You were there, Juan, at the news when I told that story. It's one of my favorites. You know, there was, and I love it because of the fact that I got it from a crusty old rank and file member of the House Wreckers Union who had sued Donald Trump for the fact that in making way for Trump Tower, and that is his signature accomplishment, it's his high-rise condo palace right in the corner of 57th Street and 5th Avenue, and to do that, he had to knock down a building that was a former famous New York City department store called Bonwit Teller. And he was in such a rush to do it, he got himself a contractor who had a union signatory to a union contract, but in fact was using all undocumented workers from Poland, hardly paying them at all. They were getting so little money that they were literally sleeping on the job site. And he, of course, made none of the donations to the union benefit fund, which he was supposed to do. So this rank-and-file member filed a lawsuit against Donald Trump for the fact that he had cheated his union out of these benefits. And Trump ended up settling, even though he completely claimed throughout the debates, I never settled lawsuits. He settled that one out of court. We never know how much he settled for, but I can tell you that that crusty old rank-and-file guy and his lawyers were very happy with how it went.
And then there was the luxury limousine company that he lent his name to as well. Talk about that one.
Credit this one to my friend Bill Bastone at smokinggun.com. In 1988, when Trump was at the peak of his days in Atlantic City, he teamed up with a guy named John Staluppi, who was a very successful and wealthy auto dealer out of Long Island, to create a new stretch limousine, kind of a Trumpmobile, that would be so lavish with these leather seats and with paper shredders and bars and everything in the world you'd ever want. John Staluppi, according to the FBI, is a made member of the Colombo crime family. You know, I'm not saying that. The FBI says that. And when Donald Trump was asked about it, he said, well, I never knew anything about that. In fact, I didn't know John Staluppi very well at all.
You talk about when Donald Trump was asked about it. Let's talk about the media's coverage of Donald Trump, Tom Robbins. What's your assessment of it and the significance of what this means, what happened in this last 24 hours with Ted Cruz pulling out, and clearly Donald Trump becoming the presumptive Republican nominee for President of the United States of America?
You know, I don't think, Amy, that the media has done a terrible job in covering these stories. There have been quite a few of them, actually. The problem is that no one has really compelled Trump to answer the questions, you know, in that he gets away with simply saying things like, well, I never heard of that guy, or I wouldn't know him. He's never been forced to sit down in a chair and really answer the kind of questions that he would have to presumably do as a Republican nominee. And I think that'll really be a telling point for the American media. Is like, okay, we know all this stuff about him, and look, he's a gold mine of these kinds of stories. We're just scratching the surface here, the ones I just mentioned. There's a lot more. This has been a deal maker in New York and across the world for 40 years. He's come up against some incredibly shady characters. So now the question is, will people get him to actually answer questions and try to get down below the level? So far, none of these stories, I think, have scratched the surface. The reason that he can win a state like Indiana is because nobody thinks badly of him.
And of course, there's still the big issue of when he will, or if he ever will, release his tax forms.
Yeah, well, I don't think we're going to see those. I think, look, Donald Trump says he's running for president in a very different way, and that's one of the ways it's going to be different. You're not going to see his tax forms.
Let me ask you, Tom Robbins, this issue of what Donald Trump says, just the outright lies just don't seem to matter. Just take, for example, the Iraq War. One of the things that's been mentioned, ways he's similar, for example, to Bernie Sanders, is that he was opposed to the war in Iraq. He's against the so-called free trade deals that are made. On the issue of the war in Iraq, he was for the war in Iraq. I mean, back then in 2002, he talked about being for it.
You know, it's a perfect example, I mean, because of the fact that there could be no more crucial difference that he claimed at the early Republican debates. He kept saying, I was the guy who said I was against the Iraq war. And he kept saying it over and over again, and nobody challenged on it until people went back and they started looking at the public record and realized, well, wait a minute, that's not really true. He was for the war in Iraq until he was clever enough, and grant him this, he's a smart man. He recognized a disaster in the making when he saw one, and he changed his position, and he started saying that, and very mildly at first. It wasn't until much later when the tide had turned that he started really saying it was a bad idea. But I think that's a really good example of like trying to get him to own up. Is, well, what were you thinking? What were you saying at that time? And his ability to slide through this stuff is astonishing. I mean, recently Politico brought together all the people who had written biographies of Trump, just to sit down at the table and swap stories. And I commend that piece to everybody who wants to read it. My friend Wayne Barrett is one of them. Tim O'Brien is one of them. Gwenda Blair, folks who had written really most in-depth biographies of him. And they tell a wonderful stories, I mean, one after another. But my favorite one was about Trump and the draft, which for people of our generation was a very big deal as to what you did during the draft. And Donald Trump has always claimed that he got out of the draft simply because of the fact that, like, they didn't need him at that point. And he talked about having a high number, which was a lottery at one point. But one of the biographers went back and checked, and he said, well, actually, you know, your date was before they're even using the lottery. How did you get out of the draft? At which point, Donald Trump says, heel spurs. I got a 4F because of my heel spurs. And the guy who wrote this book said, you know, I can't imagine how many miles on a golf course this fellow has walked. And he had too many heel spurs to walk in Vietnam. I mean, that's those kind of stories which are out there waiting to be picked.
And then, of course, there's the big story of Bernie Sanders last night. Once again, you know, the polls are wrong. The prediction that it was going to be Hillary Clinton. Now, this hasn't gotten quite as much attention as Donald Trump winning because Ted Cruz has pulled out. But Bernie Sanders won Indiana. And also, you know, it's not a winner-take-all primary. But the significance of Bernie Sanders continuing on and these continued victories.
Well, you watched it closer than I did, Amy. My sense was that they knew it was going to be close. Perhaps they were predicting a narrow Clinton victory there, but you know, Indiana demographically matches the kind of states that Bernie Sanders has done very well in, largely white electorate. And, you know, he's shown an ability to resonate with that portion of the voters in the Democratic Party that's above and beyond. So people shouldn't be surprised about the fact that he did well. Is it enough to put him over? I guess, you know, now we get into the mathematical head counting for delegates.
And I'm wondering if you could look forward as if there is a Trump Clinton contest, let's say, what you would be looking for in terms of the potential of somebody like Trump actually pulling it out.
Well, you know, it's interesting to hear Republicans talk about how scared they are of Trump being the candidate. I find that much more telling than when Democrats talk about, oh, he's unpopular among women, he's unpopular among minorities. You know, there's a certain extent I feel the Democrats are whistling past the graveyard, that they don't recognize the fact that American voters are scared, they're anxious, they're worried, they've been fed pablum and bromides about jobs that disappeared. Here's a fellow who is telling them, I can fix that, and it was wrong, and it shouldn't have happened to you. And he comes across as a strong man. And there is a section of the electorate that responds to that. And if he can curb his own instinct to, like, I mean, just he can't. He's got to stop beating up on Jeb Bush. He's got to try to figure out a way to say some nice things about other people in his party. If he can do that, I think he could be a formidable contender, much more formidable than the Democrats are thinking right now.
And Hillary Clinton being the nominee, not that she is yet, but if she is, Tom Robbins, you've been in New York City for quite a long time. Your assessment of a Trump-Clinton race?
You know, Hillary Clinton at her best is a tremendous candidate. When Hillary Clinton lets her guard down and she speaks out, I think she resonates with people, and people feel the pride of the fact that, you know, it looks like there could, for the first time, be a woman who would be the candidate of a major party. And I think that that's something that has the potential to really rally enormous numbers of voters. Hillary Clinton at her worst, which is something, unfortunately, we see a lot of, is someone who is paranoid and who is fearful and who is distrustful, and as a result, voters see her that way. And I think she has the capability of being at her best. But she's a flawed candidate. She carries a lot of baggage. And I think that Donald Trump is somebody who is incredibly good at skewing his rivals and finding the soft spot. And she's got a lot of soft spots.
We're going to break. And then when we come back, we turn to our very own Juan Gonzalez, who has just retired after 29 years as a columnist and staff writer, as a columnist at the New York Daily News. Tom Robbins, stay with us for this hour because you have a lot to say about Juan as well. And we're going to play Juan's speech when he was inducted into the Deadline Club's New York Journalism Hall of Fame. Stay with us.
¿Cuál es la verdad? Yo no sé si esto está cierto, solo sé que la vida es la barca que buscó a la isla de amor y la selva brillaba y el taíno hablaba de la tierra del valiente señor. Me cantaba al oído el areito bravío del portal del altivo señor. Yo no sé si hay eternidad, yo no sé dónde está el cielo, solo sé que los hombres de ayer morirán sin saber tú por qué. Y el político grueso nos convida al progreso, trayendo la amnesia total. Sustituye el alma por concreto con calma, trayendo la amnesia total. El amor de la patria olvidada morirá sin saber tú por qué, y tu ser volverá.
Truth by Roy Brown. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York with Juan Gonzalez. Oh, I'm Amy Goodman in Atlanta, Georgia. Juan Gonzalez is in New York. But we're going to turn right now to Juan Gonzalez. That's right. Juan has just become the first Latino journalist inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame. He, last week, retired after 29 years from the New York Daily News. Over the years, Juan has used his column to break major corruption scandals and cover-ups, including the attempt to conceal the health impacts of the toxic dust released on 9/11 in New York. In his sign-off, in his final column, Juan wrote, quote, "I opted to become a voice from another part of urban America, not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them, not simply to entertain, but to change, not after the fact, but before it, when coverage could still make a difference." In November of last year, Juan was inducted, yes, into Deadline Club's New York Journalism Hall of Fame, becoming the first Latino journalist to be selected for the honor. He was inducted along with Charlie Rose, New York Times journalist Max Frankel, 60 Minutes correspondent Leslie Stahl, ProPublica founder Paul Steiger, and Time magazine journalist and editor Richard Stolley. Juan was introduced by the Deadline Club's J. Alex Tarquinio.
Juan Gonzalez has been a staff columnist with the New York Daily News since 1987 and co-host of the syndicated radio and television news program Democracy Now! Since 1996. I believe there are a few of you here. His books include Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, News for All the People, The Epic Story of Race in the American Media, and Fallout, The Environmental Consequences of the World Trade Center Collapse. Gonzalez has received 2 George Polk Awards for commentary and has been named to the Hall of Fame of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Please welcome Juan Gonzalez.
My thanks to the Deadline Club for this honor. It's still hard to believe you consider my writing and reporting worthy of being recognized next to the amazing figures you've previously inducted into the Hall of Fame and beside this extraordinary group of my fellow nominees this year. Are you sure somebody didn't make a mistake? I'm just amazed that I still have a job at the Daily News, given all the upheaval brought about in our media industry by the digital age. A few weeks ago, during our last round of heartbreaking layoffs at the News, I was sitting in an editorial board meeting with a bunch of reporters and editors interviewing Governor Cuomo when one of my editors, Rob Moore, who was sitting next to me, suddenly pointed to his smartphone. "The Observer's reporting you've been fired," he told me. I took a deep breath and said to him, "Well, can you confirm that for me?" "You have nothing to worry about," Rob said. He didn't add, "for now." Well, I was already fired by the Daily News. 25 years ago last month, our owner at the time, the Tribune Company, declared me and 2,500 reporters, ad sellers, pressmen, drivers permanently replaced for daring to go out on a labor strike. It took us 5 long months on picket lines and protests through a bitterly cold winter, but we eventually won that strike, during which I somehow managed as chair of the Guild's strike committee to earn the respect of all those old-line Irish and Italian reporters at the News who until then had disdained me as some kind of unqualified affirmative action hire. Tribune sold the paper to British billionaire Robert Maxwell, who then proceeded to negotiate a deal with the unions and welcomed us back. So I've actually been living on borrowed time for the past 25 years. As some of you may know, mine has not been the typical journalism career these past 37 years. I've managed to work not only in mainstream journalism, but proudly in the alternative and dissident press, most notably for the past 20 years with Democracy Now! With a terrific journalist and friend, Amy Goodman, who's here today. But also at various times in the Spanish language or ethnic press. In addition, I must be the only reporter in mainstream journalism with an extensive rap sheet, having been arrested about a dozen times over 4 decades in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s on a variety of charges: criminal trespass, contempt of court, marijuana possession, inciting to riot, draft evasion, all except for the marijuana bust related to political protests. Mike McAlery often joked to me that one day he went into the old Daily News library and came across the paper's clips on my radical days. This was when papers still had massive dusty files of yellow cutout articles stuffed into pocket folders under various subjects and names. There Mac found the old stories on me. The clip folder title was Juan Gonzalez Revolutionary. But by then, someone had crossed out revolutionary and changed it to Daily News columnist. So yes, I had a prior life, and I didn't really get started into mainstream journalism until I was already in my 30s. That I ended up a reporter at all, you can chalk up to Miss Bonagura and to the young lords. One gave me the skills, and the other gave me the heart. Pauline Bonagura was the one public school teacher every kid dreams about. She was an English and journalism instructor at Franklin K. Lane High School in East New York, Brooklyn. Young, charismatic, relentless, she had a hopeless love affair with the English language and was determined all her students would master not only grammar and writing, but the art of reporting. The number of fine journalists she produced is remarkable. David Vidal, who for years was a foreign correspondent for The Times, Steve Handelman, who worked for decades at the Toronto Star, Carol Carmichael, who was an editor at the Seattle Times, Janet McMillan, a reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer for many years. All of us were Bonagura's students. She plucked me, a shy kid from a working-class Puerto Rican family in the Cypress Hills projects of East New York, and chose me to be the editor of her paper, The Lane Reporter, that paper that almost every year won the Columbia Scholastic Journalism Prize. And that probably had a lot to do with my eventually getting into Columbia on a full scholarship. And it was there that I first became acquainted with dissident views and social protests and ended up in SDS and the Columbia student strike of 1968. Then came the Young Lords. Jimmy Breslin once wrote that the Lords produce more good journalists than Columbia J School. The Lords were a loud, brash, radical, and talented group of Puerto Ricans. We became a thorn in the side of the establishment and the police in this town and in cities throughout the East Coast for a brief time, and influenced a generation of young Latinos to demand more equitable treatment for our community. But of all the radical groups of the 60s, and there were many back then, we probably received the most sympathetic press coverage. Even as youngsters, we understood the power of the press, and we consciously cultivated good coverage. We were helped by the first brilliant crop of young Black and Latino reporters in the city's media, to whom we fed exclusives, and who in turn repaid us with more all-around and sound coverage. People like a young Ed Bradley at WCBS, Gil Noble at WABC, Gloria Rojas at WNBC, Rudy Garcia at the Daily News, and of course, liberal white writers like Jack Newfield at the Village Voice. And we published our own newspaper, Palante, that I edited for a while. So it was no accident that when the Lords fell apart in the mid-1970s, several of us ended up going into journalism. Pablo Guzman, Felipe Luciano, Geraldo Rivera, our first lawyer, everybody knows Geraldo, and myself. Or that when we landed there, we were all drawn to uncovering injustices and digging deeper than some journalists were accustomed to. My first job at the Philadelphia Daily News in 1978, I became friendly with Pete Dexter, one of the paper's big-name columnists. So what's it like to write a column? I asked Pete one day. It sure beats working for a living, he told me. I quickly became hooked on the idea of becoming a columnist. And so what I've been doing the last 27 years or so, I think 27, 28 years now at the Daily News, well, I had to figure out what I wanted to do as a columnist when I came here. And I decided that in a city brimming with extraordinary veteran newspaper columnists, Jimmy Breslin, Mary Kempton, Pete Hamill, Russell Baker, Sidney Schamberg, and awash with so many able young writers, I figured my modest contribution would be a voice from another part of New York, not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them, not simply to entertain, but to change, not after the fact, but before it, when coverage could still make a difference. In daily newspaper writing, time becomes both an enemy and an ally. What you lose in the chance to chisel and refine for the relative few, you gain in the opportunity to influence and energize the many. I have tried to use as many of my columns as possible to probe the injustices visited upon the powerless. Yes, the rich and the famous are also victims on occasion. But they have so many politicians, lobbyists, lawyers, gossip columnists, even editorial writers ready to jump to their defense that they'll always do fine without my help. I prefer the desperate unknown reader who comes to me because he or she has gone everywhere else and no one will listen. More often than not, I come across unexpected gems, human beings whose tragedies illuminate the landscape and whose courage hopefully inspires the reader to believe that there is indeed some greater good served by a free press than just chronicling or influencing the ousting of one group of politicians by another. So by giving me this award, and the first Latino journalist, I think, to be so honored by the Deadline Club, I assume you have looked beyond my rap sheet, beyond my rabble-rousing days, and determined that I did indeed add something of value to this great city while not working for a living all these years. Thank you.
Juan Gonzalez in November, speaking at Sardi's in New York, when he became the first Latino journalist inducted into the Deadline Club's New York Journalism Hall of Fame. When we come back, Tom Robbins and Juan, well, we'll all reflect on Juan's 29-year career as a columnist at the New York Daily News. Stay with us.
Que viva aquel gran patriota que siempre luchó por ella, defendiendo siempre nuestra bandera puertorriqueña. Otra vez. Que vino a Estados Unidos y estudió en grandes escuelas y después fue a Puerto Rico a defender su bandera. Otra vez. Que viva Betance y Albizu Campo en la nueva era. Albizu símbolo vivo de la bandera puertorriqueña. Otra vez.
Que bonita bandera. What a beautiful flag by Pepe Flora. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia, and New York City. I am Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez in New York. On Monday night, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, New York Senator Chuck Schumer, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio, Congressmember Jose Serrano, journalist Geraldo Rivera, and others celebrated Juan Gonzalez's 29-year career at the New York Daily News during an event Monday night at the Francis Tavern. We are joined by longtime New York journalist Tom Robbins, who is a recent Pulitzer finalist for his coverage of violence in New York's prisons. Tom, a longtime columnist and staff writer at The Village Voice and the New York Daily News, where he worked with Juan Gonzalez for over a decade. He recently wrote an article headlined Juan Gonzalez, Iron Man of the Newsroom. Tom's now an investigative journalist in residence at the CUNY Journalism School. So, Tom, you were there. What an amazing event. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you all. But, Juan, what a scene in New York as I was getting live tweets of the photographs of first the governor, and then the mayor. God forbid they should be in the same room at the same time, but it was you who brought them into the same room, even if they weren't there at the same time. Tom, I'm not going to ask Juan because he's too modest, but talk about Juan's significance as a journalist.
You know, Andrew Cuomo was singing Juan's praises the other night, and a lot of us in the room who have watched Andrew Cuomo squirming in the last few weeks, given his own problems, you know, we're sort of thinking, you know, he's sort of escaping from, you know, the questions that reporters would otherwise be asking him. But in fact, he was, I think, speaking from the heart about his true admiration for reporters like Juan who get below the surface. Juan's ability to both, you know, dig deep and ask tough questions has never gotten in the way of his relationships with people, which is an amazing thing. And that's one of the reasons you had the crowded room at Francis Tavern. I think it's another reason why you had the Deadline Club event that we just witnessed surrounded by adoring fans. Juan has an ability to both tell the truth and keep people liking him, which is sometimes a tough thing to do.
And the years of coverage, I mean, the kind of stories that Juan has broken.
You know, when I got to the news about 6 months after Juan did, and me and Jack Newfield came together from the Village Voice, and with the way Juan just described himself to the Deadline Club in terms of like him being like kind of like odd man out in a way was really true. Juan was, you know, clearly not only the only key Latino reporter in the room, he was the only columnist, you know, at that time, and he was looked at askance by other folks. And he never let that bother him for a moment. You know, he just marched on and he did the stories. He worked. As one of the editors said the other night at the party for him, Arthur Brown, Juan worked every day to dig the stories, and in the process of which he forged a bond with, I think, working New Yorkers, something I mentioned in this column I just wrote about him for the Public Employee Press, the Municipal Workers Union, so that people trusted him enough to bring him news and information and stuff they weren't supposed to talk about. And Juan was able to parlay that along with his own inbred sense of like what's a good story and his stick-to-itiveness into one scoop after another. You mentioned earlier in the show being the only reporter in New York to write the truth about what was happening to air quality in Lower Manhattan after the Twin Towers fell. I mean, just think about that for a moment. That's a pretty remarkable scoop for anybody under any circumstances. But more remarkable is the fact that after Juan wrote it, and it was, I think, a front-page story initially, there was such a ferocious roarback from the federal secretary for air quality, from the mayor, and then from his own editors, who then really asked Juan to tone it down and to stop doing what he was doing. And Juan, he has this sheepish grin. I wasn't in the room, but I could see him just sort of shrugging and saying, sorry, I'm doing my job. And the editors, I think, understood that, like, saying no to Juan Gonzalez was not a very good idea. It just didn't work out very well. And they're all gone, by the way. And Juan was still there until he got up of his own decision from his seat last week.
So, Juan, you united politicians, I won't say across the political spectrum. You have de Blasio and Cuomo, both Democrats. But you got all these people, well over 100 people in this room for your retirement. How did it feel?
Well, it was, it was a good feeling to know that, because Cuomo did say when he gave me this award, he said, well, Juan Gonzalez has never stopped beating me like a drum, but that he would think enough of my work to show up and to say goodbye. I even had a former police commissioner Ray Kelly there, who, as Tom says, once cuffed me when I was in the Lords, and he was a young cop, so he showed up with his wife to say goodbye. So I think it was it felt good because it's been a long road. It's definitely been a long road, and I know, Tom, you and I bonded especially during the period early on of the Daily News strike, which was a traumatic experience for all of us. 5 months. I don't know how many people have been on. I'm sure many of our viewers and listeners have, at one point or another, been on strike. But a labor strike is a really traumatic experience in a person's life. And we were out there for 5 months, and many people thought they'd never get their jobs back. But we were able to prevail, and I think that helped very much in terms of building the respect of the management of the paper, as well as of my fellow workers, that we were able to stick it out together, and that I helped assist in trying to figure out the best way to do that.
Look, Juan was a twofer. I mean, papers are lucky enough to get a great reporter who's going to dig it and can tell it really well. But Juan was an incredible organizer. Is an incredible organizer. When he says that those 5 months are traumatic, it doesn't begin to talk about it. But Juan never broke a sweat. I mean, that was a remarkable thing. The newspaper guild was in total chaos at the time we went out, and Juan led us together.
I want to thank you, Tom Robbins, for joining us. And Juan, congratulations on all that you have accomplished. You may have left that New York Daily News, but I'm really thankful that you're staying with your other DN. That's right, with Democracy Now! And that does it for the show. Juan Gonzalez, read all of his books. News for All the People, Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos America. Roll down your window, Stories of a Forgotten America. I'll be speaking in Spokane, Washington, and then on to Olympia and Seattle. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thank you so much for joining us.